All right. Now, if you haven't had a chance to watch the short clip on the Declaration of Independence and really get an understanding of the Declaration of Independence, we're looking now at the second part of the Revolutionary War, sort of post-Declaration of Independence. We've officially declared our independence. It's officially underway at this point. There appears to be no turning back, and I would say that most Americans kind of felt that way. But what happens next is sort of really important. Remember, we left off in part one saying the British have retreated and that Washington is in Boston. And the result is that now he has to make a decision. Washington realizes he has an army that is poorly equipped, but he has to do something. So the question is, where will the British return? And what happens next is really amazing. Washington makes a prediction, and he ends up being correct. The Empire strikes back. And when the British return, they return in July of 1776 to New York City. And we recall this, the Empire strikes back, because if you remember, they left Boston, 4,000 men, dozens of ships. When they return, 32,000 soldiers, 400 ships. They come back with a force that is incredible. And so when the British return to the colonies at New York, this is the beginning of what I refer to as sort of a master plan. Howe is going to try and, he's the general in charge, he's going to try and isolate the people of New England, where the problem is. Remember that snake we looked at, the whole idea of the snake which says join or die, and then we actually had one that said don't tread on me. Imagine that the head of the snake is New England. The rest of the snake is the other colonies. Well, they're going to try and cut off the head of the snake. They're going to try and deal with the problem directly. And that's Howe's plan. How that plan comes together, we'll find out in the next few minutes. George Washington assembled his men after Boston, moved his men to New York, prepared and fortified the city, trying to prepare it for an attack by the British. He divides his army into two smaller groups, which is a major disaster. He already has a smaller army than the British. By dividing it in half, the armies become even smaller. And as the situation gets worse, as the British begin to attack, he realizes he has no choice but to retreat. When he retreats from New York, and you kind of may want to have a look at a map here as we're talking about this, but he retreats from New York into New Jersey. And in the process, he loses about 1,000 of his men. One of those people that is sort of important in this whole process is Nathan Hale. Now, Nathan Hale isn't important in the sense that he's a key player in the whole process of the retreat or the actual battle. But Nathan Hale goes down in history as a man who was captured by the British as a spy. He was sent over to get information about the British location by Washington, because of course when you're retreating you want to make sure you know where your enemy's at. And in the process, Nathan Hale, when he gets captured, is actually hung. And when he's hung, he's allowed to say a few words beforehand. And what he says very plainly is, and this really kind of made the British, it disturbed the British. And the reason why it's so important to us as Americans. But he said, I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. That I couldn't sacrifice myself more and more and often, because I do it for the sake of freedom. And this, again, really kind of bothered the British, because they realized that these people weren't going to fight until they just got tired. They were going to fight until they got their independence. If that's what it took, till every one of them was dead, it appeared that they were willing to do that. Then in the late fall, early winter of 76, he retreats further, going all the way through New Jersey, all the way up to the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and he crosses the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Now, that's not the famous crossing of the Delaware. We're going to get upon that right now. As he goes into Pennsylvania, Washington's problem is now in December of 1776. He spent the last 6 months running from the British. His men are tired. Many of them are injured in some way. Feet are sore, wounds that haven't healed since New York. And so what they find themselves in a situation, Washington finds himself in a situation, he's very desperate at this point to make sure he keeps his army together. Washington gets information that over in Trenton there's a group of people that are called Hessians. These are mercenaries that have been hired by the British. They're Germans. And they're there in Trenton. And so Washington makes a decision that on Christmas Day Eve, on the 25th of December at night, he would attack Trenton. Now, why does he choose this day? Well, first of all, the Hessians wouldn't think that there'd be an attack. The Germans are Christians. They're celebrating Christmas. They're having a good time all day long. Who in their right mind would attack on Christmas Day? Right? That's the first thing. Second of all, the ice covered the river. And the problem with that is you can't march an army across a frozen river. You have to wait until the ice breaks up. There's always the danger, of course, the ice being too thin, and most of your army slips through the ice and is killed, or you lose cannon, or you lose horses. And this is not something that you want to risk. And so what happens on the day before Christmas, Christmas Eve, and Christmas Day, is the weather warms up a little bit because of a snowstorm. And the result is that the river breaks up. The ice begins to become chunks. And you can see in this picture here, first of all, not realistic because George Washington would not have stood up in his boat. Foolish. But realistic in the sense that they've got to push the pieces of ice away from the boat as they move across the river. So they move across the river that night, and most of the evening is spent moving Washington's 12,000 men across the river to the other side. And they get across the river sometime late in the evening, somewhere around midnight, 1 a.m. They're there, and they begin the long march into Trenton, arriving in the early morning of the day after Christmas. When they arrive in Trenton, the Hessians are completely surprised. See, they had spent most of Christmas eating and drinking, and this was a tradition in the German army. The commanders would always provide large amounts of food and beer on Christmas Day to their soldiers. And so when Washington's men arrive, there's this absolute surprise on the part of the Hessians, and the battle goes very quickly, and they give up. This was instrumental in making sure that Washington's army stays together. One of the things that's more important is that Washington's army, which had signed up for a year, had actually signed up at the beginning of 1776, which means that as of January 1st, 1777, they could all go home if they wanted to. And the result is that when they have this victory at Trenton, they are able to keep the army together. There's now hope. There's a reason to stay. And the result is that Washington's army, because of this victory, is going to stick together and continue to fight for another year. The guys are going to sign up again eventually, essentially. The next battle we're going to talk about, and we're kind of skipping very quickly here, we're going to skip almost 9 months ahead, is the Battle of Saratoga, New York. And the two gentlemen here that you see, General Burgoyne and General Hale, are the men that are really instrumental in this particular battle. But this is the culmination of that plan we talked about at the beginning of the section. General Hale wanting to cut off the head of the snake, General Burgoyne being part of that plan. The British generals Burgoyne and Hale are going to move into a position where they're going to basically isolate New England from the rest of the colonies and then focus their power and their military power on New England. So the plan is that General Hale would move from New York City up the Hudson River to Albany, and that General Burgoyne would be up here in Quebec, which is off the map. General Burgoyne would move south along Lake Champlain down to Albany to join him. And you can see here that separates what we call New England, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, from the rest of the colonies. And that really is the plan. Along the way, General Burgoyne is going to actually recapture Fort Ticonderoga. But as he moves through the wilderness after Fort Ticonderoga, we can go back to that map, you'll notice that this area here is forest. And as they move the army from Quebec past Fort Ticonderoga at Lake Champlain, and they begin to move south towards Albany, he stalls in the forest. And what that means is this. If you can look at the picture here, and it's hard to find pictures that are representative of this very well, but you can notice how close together the trees are in the picture. And you'll notice that there's really not space to walk. If you're going to walk through this forest, you have to walk along a trail or a road. What the Americans do is they cut down trees across the road. So General Burgoyne is just having a very difficult time moving his army down to Albany, which gives General Gates, who's the American general in charge here, time to actually assemble his men and prepare for a battle in a place of his choosing, which is going to be this place called Saratoga, which is a giant clearing. It's an open area along the Hudson River, sort of in the midst of this forest. There's this giant meadow. And this is where the battle takes place. And as the British enter the giant clearing, the giant area, Americans come from all sides out of the forest and begin to attack the British. Now this battle goes on and off several times in the month of September until finally 5,700 prisoners are taken by the Americans, and the British are suffering heavy losses. And the result is that this is going to be considered the greatest victory during the war. It's also significant for another reason, and that is the French are going to join the war as a result. Back in Paris, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson have been talking for a very long time with the French, trying to convince them that this would be a good idea to help us. And of course the French are reluctant because, well, they got themselves kicked all over the place by the British back in the French and Indian War. But when news of this battle reaches Paris, the result is that there is this tremendous enthusiasm on the part of the French to get involved, to have sort of a moment of revenge, if you want to call it that. And they're going to supply us with an army as well as their fleet. And this is going to be of great service to us. The Marquis de Lafayette is a key sort of player in all this because he is the general in charge of that 6,000-man army that the French send. He's going to eventually become a very good friend of George Washington's. He's a very capable general, unlike a lot of other generals that show up from Europe, because many of them are sons of nobles and they don't really have much to do besides be generals because daddy's got so much money and daddy's busy with business. The result is that many of those generals who were noblemen from Europe very often weren't the best generals. In the winter of 1777 and 78, George Washington decides to take his men to a place called Valley Forge. And while in Valley Forge, about 3,000 of the men that are there are barefoot. About 2,500 of them will die. And the main problem in Valley Forge is the lack of food. Now, this is not an uncommon thing. Armies winter. They spend the winter in a place because fighting, of course, in the snow and the cold is very difficult. His problem in Valley Forge, believe it or not, was not that there wasn't food nearby. His problem was the people that had the food weren't willing to give the food. See, the entire area around Valley Forge in Pennsylvania is in fact filled with Quakers, and they're nonviolent, and they weren't going to supply an army with food. Even when the British asked, for instance, we know that we have records of those people actually taking their food, in some cases destroying it, or burying it, burning it, in order to prevent any kind of movement of food into the hands of the army, which would encourage fighting. Valley Forge is not important because it was a battle. It's not important necessarily because a lot of men died. What's important really as a result of this particular event is that Washington and his army become closer, that they bond as a result of Valley Forge. Washington takes time every day to tour the camp, and as a result there are positive things that come out of this. The men grow closer together. They have to take care of each other. Many of them are hurting, they're hungry, and they're now helping each other, and they become closer as a result. They begin to trust and admire Washington more. Their general doesn't go away and stay in some big house. Their general comes every day and asks how they're doing. He wants to be sort of intimately involved in the whole process, not just simply the guy on the outside giving the orders to the army. They're also going to get the opportunity here to train this winter. And you can see this picture down here at the bottom of the screen. This is a picture of a German colonel who actually leaves the Hessian army and joins the American army and is going to help train us and prepare us to fight the British in the next year. From 1778, 79 into 80, the British are going to change their tactics. They couldn't cut off the head of the snake because of Saratoga, so instead they're going to kill the rest of the snake. I'm not sure what the difference is. If you cut off the head, do you kill the rest of the snake? Or if you cut off the rest of the snake, do you kill the head? And that's sort of what they're thinking here. Instead of going after New England, what if we go after the rest of the colonies, leaving New England? And so the British had sent a very large army down into the southern colonies, and this general by the name of General Cornwallis, his job is to move from Georgia into South Carolina, into North Carolina, and all the way up into Virginia, taking the colony after colony after colony until basically New England was left. Well, as they move into Virginia, George Washington moves his army in to block their movement. And we get the Battle of Yorktown. Now, Yorktown is an interesting place. It's actually a peninsula in Virginia. And what happens is, as Cornwallis moves his army out onto this peninsula, trying to get into a position where he can get resupplied by British ships that are coming from New York, he's going to eventually find himself trapped as George Washington moves in and blocks his sort of retreat off the peninsula. Now, that wouldn't have really worked all that well if it was for the fact that wasn't for the fact that the British fleet never makes it, and that's because the French attack the British, and there's a large battle that takes place in the Chesapeake Bay just off Yorktown Peninsula, and the British end up surrendering. When the British surrender, there's this large ceremony, and Lafayette plays an important role in all this, as the British play a very sad piece of music as they're turning over their weapons and the officers are handing over their swords. Lafayette orders his men, hey, I want you to strike up the band, and I want you to play Yankee Doodle, which is really a British drinking song that was meant to make fun of Americans, but instead this is now used to make fun of the British here at the end of the war. As a result of the Battle of Yorktown, the war is officially over. Most of the fighting is going to stop. There's small skirmishes here and there, of course, are going to occur, but most of the British soldiers are being moved out of the colonies back to Canada. Ben Franklin and John Jay are negotiating in Paris again, this time, of course, in Paris negotiating with the British. And in September of 1783, 2 years after Yorktown, they finally agree to a treaty called the Treaty of Paris. And this treaty is pretty simple. We're independent. British have to leave the colonies in terms of their soldiers. But more importantly, what happens is that the British are going to give to us that area of land called the Ohio River Valley, that part of the territory that really was sort of the center of the argument at the very, very beginning, back with the proclamation line of 1783. The result is that the British are going to hand over this territory. And if you look at the map, the red area, you'll notice that the British, the colonies, are actually more than doubling in size. So this is the size of the colonies before the war. And notice that the area that we gain is an area that is more than twice the size of what we had. We essentially take a country that is very small, the colonies. And by the end of the war, it's turned into a country that is larger than England. It's larger than France. It's a massive piece of territory. And it's only going to grow further after the war. Within a few years, within about 15 years, we're going to find that another large chunk of it is added to the map, and it begins to look more and more like what we see the map today.